It was a war, the making of Rebecca.
Selznick was well known as a meddler, as a man who wanted his stamp on a picture. Hitchcock was well known as a man who knew how to make a movie that said Hitchcock. When you have a man who is an auteur before the term was even coined, who is working with a producer who thinks, and is in fact an auteur, who stamps his films a David O. Selznick production, you're going to have trouble, and you did have trouble.
I'd say that the pairing of my grandfather and David Selznick was almost like the tortoise and the hare. One's just flying by and 100 miles an hour every which way. The tortoise is just plugging along. But in the end, the tortoise is the one who wins the race. And the tortoise is the one, in this case, my grandfather, whose career lasted for so many years.
I think he learned a lot from Selznick. And I think Selznick learned a lot from Hitchcock.
He was probably the most successful English director. He made a series of very successful films. The Original Man Who Knew Too Much, The Lady Vanishes, The 39 Steps, Blackmail. Those were among the most popular English films ever made.
Hitchcock understood that the world needs to think about art as coming from a single individual artist. Often a person who's incredibly idiosyncratic or brilliant or tortured, like Vincent van Gogh or Pablo Picasso.
Alfred Hitchcock's personality was an important asset to him. He discovered very early on that by making himself into a character for the press, he could draw attention to himself and most importantly to his films. And much like Cecil B. DeMille before him, he made his name something that was almost, you might say, bankable. People came to associate Hitchcock with a certain kind of filmmaking.
Hitch was in part a prisoner of his own image. That was a popular figure, and people had developed a kind of an affection for him, as they might for a slightly odd uncle, you know. He was, however, an infinitely more complex guy.
My grandfather really was, besides the master of suspense, the master of creating his public personality, because he was very different to his family and to his friends. He was not the strange, weird person that everybody would always ask, oh, he must be really weird. And we'd say, no, he's not weird at all.
Hitchcock had modeled himself on Cecil B. DeMille, the director. Selznick had modeled himself on Cecil B. DeMille, the producer. Selznick was all about the producer as auteur, as author of the film. And you can see that in Gone with the Wind, which went through a series of directors. The unity is Selznick's vision.
David O. Selznick is one of those people who embodies the golden age of Hollywood. His father had been in the business, had been powerful and had then fallen. His brother was one of the great agents. And David was the man who made Gone with the Wind.
The O didn't stand for anything. The David O. Selznick, he just picked the O because he thought it sounded well. It didn't stand for anything.
He was a chronic memo dictator. He was an interferer, but he was touched by genius, and he loved film, and he loved every aspect of filmmaking.
Now, this is a guy who is in his late 30s, in the 1930s, who by the time he's 35 years old, has been head of production at Paramount, at RKO, and has had his own production unit, his own A-class production unit at MGM. And as he's kind of reaching the peak of his career at MGM in the mid-30s, he decides to start his own company.
His first independent picture was a little something called Gone with the Wind.
Selznick was the man who got Hitchcock to come to America.
Hitchcock had wanted for years to go to Hollywood, where he knew the equipment was a good deal more sophisticated. And you know, Hitchcock had a technical side that loved the idea of working with better equipment, better craftsmen. So he had his eye on going to Hollywood. And I think you have to say that as he felt war was coming, and Hitchcock was a man who knew Germany quite well, and therefore I think was in no doubt at all about the coming of the war. I think he was quite anxious to get himself and his family out of Britain. I think he believed trouble was coming.
So
America for Hitchcock, as it was for many directors, was the promised land.
Hitchcock read the manuscript of Rebecca, which had not yet been published. He was friends with du Maurier's brother. Unfortunately, he could not afford to buy it.
Hitchcock was very interested in Rebecca before the project actually came to him through David O. Selznick. He tried to acquire the rights, but then discovered that, in fact, Selznick was in negotiation and he knew he couldn't compete.
1937, he had just finished Young Innocent. He didn't edit it yet. A cable came from David O. Selznick.
David's brother, Myron Selznick, had a very, very effective English office. And they had Hitchcock as a client already, so that it was a very, I mean, the family were talking about Hitchcock, you know.
He originally was going to come over to the United States to make the movie Titanic.
Selznick, toward that end, bought a ship. It was called the Leviathan. And when Hitch arrived by ship from England in 1939, Selznick met him at the pier and immediately put him into cars, and they all drove out to the Brooklyn Navy Yard to take a look at this ship he'd bought, which was going to be the Titanic. And as Hitch tells the story, you know, he brought us out there, and there it was, right there. He said, "There it is, Hitch. Make the most of it." I thought to myself, make the most of it, make the most of it. Let's see now. We'll start with a close-up of a rivet and pull back. And that was the end of it. They never did come up with anything to do with the Titanic. So anyway, Titanic didn't work out. And what then became the first American Hitchcock picture was Rebecca.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Mandalay again.
Selznick demanded that Hitchcock remain very faithful to the novel.
But the way Hitchcock approached Rebecca was a novel, and a very successful novel, but we're making a picture of the novel. And there's no reason to be slavish about it. In fact, there's every reason to be ruthless.
David Selznick wanted every scene in Daphne du Maurier's novel up there on the screen. That was the opposite of Hitchcock's method. He would cut the story to pieces, completely retell it from a very subjective point of view, and it was the book was just an occasion for the movie.
One of the reasons he didn't like to adapt great works of literature was because one felt obliged to remain too faithful to them, and it was a lesson that he learned significantly after the adaptation of The Secret Agent into Sabotage. I think he realized there, because that was the one instance where he adapted a great novel or a great work to the screen, that it just was, you know, too much to have that shadow you as a filmmaker.
Hitchcock isn't really interested in taking works that are already kind of golden and burnishing them further. He's interested in transforming the less successful works, taking that and making it into the core of his own distinctive vision, his own distinctive films.
There was a lot of back and forth about how faithful his adaptation would be to the novel. Selznick had this idea about picturization. It's kind of a curious word for an adaptation. And it seems to suggest that the role of the movie is, in some sense, to sort of give visual pictures or images to the novel. Because Selznick felt that people had become so attached to the story that they really wouldn't tolerate any kind of deviance.
Hitchcock had started a script which had introduced Maxim de Winter on a ship sailing to the Riviera, puffing a cigar, making his fellow passengers seasick, you know, establishing somebody as an imperious aristocrat who doesn't really care what he does to other people.
So eventually Selznick looked at the adaptation that Hitchcock and one of his writers did, and it was not what David Selznick had in mind.
Selznick hit the roof, since he says, "We bought this best-selling novel. You are going to film this best-selling novel."
Selznick, in his way, tried always to be faithful to the books. And the better he liked the book, the more he would try to be faithful to it.
And this kind of back and forth went on again and again and again, and I think it resulted in souring Hitchcock on the picture.
Selznick definitely saw Hitchcock as a writer-director and who might produce his own films. This whole idea of a talented producer who could assemble projects under his own purview and get them made. He saw Hitchcock possibly as one of these types of filmmakers. Unfortunately, however, when Hitchcock did a screenplay draft of Rebecca, the du Maurier novel, Selznick hated it. I mean, he really hated it, demoting Hitchcock to mere director status.
No, stop!
What the devil are you shouting about? Who are you? What are you staring at?
The story of the casting of Rebecca is interesting because there was a direct attempt by David O. Selznick to repeat the Scarlett O'Hara frenzy, where virtually every actress in Hollywood was tested for the role of Scarlett O'Hara.
They were testing many people. Loretty Young was tested.
And Baxter tested.
Margaret Sullivan was tested.
Olivia de Havilland tested.
Joan Fontaine was tested.
The rivalry between the de Havilland sisters is a fascinating topic. Olivia had certainly made her impact first. There was also the fact that Selznick was personally smitten with Fontaine at the time. I think he adored her. That had something to do with her being cast.
Hitchcock, when I worked with him, then later both on Marnie, which I'd worked with him before on, but then later in Family Plot, he told me stories. He said he always tried to put them together in movies, but there was just no way. And so he got Joan Fontaine all the time. He said, I always wanted to put Olivia in the crowd in a scene and not tell Joan she was going to be there. And then suddenly Joan would go in to the market to buy something, and there would be Olivia. And she wouldn't even know it, and the other one wouldn't know it, and they'd both see each other, and just to film it and get their nasty faces looking at each other. And he loved, I mean, that was it. He just loved that kind of stuff.
Selznick considered himself very much in tune with what women were like, what women wanted, what women would respond to in someone on screen. It took next to forever to cast Joan Fontaine, who in retrospect looks like a terrific choice.
To play that lead part in Rebecca, you have to understand what it is to have an overwhelming force in your life that is more powerful than you are, which is an unusual thing, I think. Not everyone has had that experience. But the way in which her character does not even have a name, the various absences of identity in the film are very interesting, and I think it's a great performance from Fontaine, great performance.
Laurence Olivier wasn't all that thrilled with getting Joan Fontaine, and he had recommended Vivien Leigh, who was in America, and they were having a great love affair, and Vivien Leigh had asked him to get the part for her, but David O. Selznick did not see her as the character who was called I in the film.
Before Rebecca, Joan Fontaine was not considered even a remotely bankable star.
Joan Fontaine was chosen by Hitchcock. She was screen tested. Selznick had doubts. Hitchcock said, I can get her through it.
Hitchcock wanted to show that he could build a performance, that he could get a performance out of someone. So his reputation was at stake.
He devoted much of his time during the making of Rebecca to taking care of Joan Fontaine and helping her emerge as a great actress. Interestingly enough, he totally neglected her during the making of their second film, Suspicion, because he knew she already knew how to do it. And he concentrated on other things, and that one won her an Oscar.
Oh, but you don't understand. It's that I'm not the sort of person men marry.
What on earth do you mean?
I don't belong in your sort of world, for one thing.
Was Selznick a producer that interfered?
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, the big shock I had was when I rehearsed the scene and script girl said, I said, well, let's go. He said, oh, wait a minute, I have to see it for Mr. Selznick. Before a scene was shot, he had to come down and see it.
It must have been aggravating.
Very annoying.
Hitchcock felt it as interference because in England, Hitchcock had earned the reputation already of being so good you could leave it to him. For Selznick, it was not nearly as obviously interference because it was the way he'd operated all along.
Joan Fontaine said that whenever Selznick came on the set, as he was wont to do from time to time, I think it was the right of the owner of Selznick International to do that. Directors be damned. But Fontaine said you can always tell when Selznick was on the set, and that sometimes when that happened, shooting for some mysterious reason would shut down. Hitchcock didn't want somebody looking over his shoulder.
As soon as Selznick left, the cameras would be working again. And of course, when Selznick saw all of the footage, he never provided him with enough footage. Hitchcock didn't, purposely.
Was he quite upset that you shot only what you needed and gave him no latitude for cutting?
Very. To use his own words, he said, "I can't get on with this goddamn jigsaw cutting of yours."
Well, it prevented him from...
I didn't do it to prevent him doing anything. It's just the way one shot, you know.
Yeah. But it did, in fact, prevent him from recutting the pictures, didn't it?
Yes, it did. He had to cut it the way it was.
Yeah.
Certainly there was consultation between producer and director on Rebecca, because there's still a courtship going on between these two. Selznick wants to keep Hitchcock reasonably happy. And so the notion of releasing a Rebecca that would look very different from the one that Hitchcock imagined when he shot would be in Selznick's worst interest.
What was the story you told me about Rebecca?
Well, he wanted the house to go up in smoke and form the letter R.
The smoke to form the R.
Hitchcock maintained a certain respectability at the end of Rebecca by blunting one of the suggestions that was made to him, that the smoke from Manderley form itself into a kind of giant R. A little cheesy, I'm afraid.
For me, the most striking part of the fire is the fact that it is set by Mrs. Danvers, and it seems to both reflect the inferno that is within her and to reclaim her to where she came from, which is to say, hell itself.
There's the scene in Rebecca, one of my favorite scenes, and anybody who likes Rebecca, probably his or her favorite scene too, where Mrs. Danvers plays guide to Rebecca's room. One of the things that also comes off in that scene, which is interesting in retrospect, is the question, what was the relationship between Rebecca and her housekeeper? It seems unusual. It seems that Mrs. Danvers was perhaps attracted to her. And this, in fact, was recognized during the period of the making of the film because the censors wanted to be sure that nothing of an improper relationship was suggested. In fact, they put it on the nose. Nothing of a lesbian relationship was suggested by the relationship of Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. Many years later, when Judith Anderson was asked about this, did you at the time play this scene so that that was an invitation to a viewer to think about it? Why, no, we never thought of such things at that time, which is interesting and in fact may be true. It may not just be lapsed memory. It may be true that it was not talked about. But again, when we talk about a picture that's Hitchcockian, that's what we mean. He somehow weaves in the shadow of this unusual relationship between the housekeeper and Rebecca. But the censors couldn't see it because it was woven into the visuals through the magic of Hitchcock.
Look, you can see my hand through it.
Rebecca is an amazingly faithful adaptation, up to the point where Maxim confesses the murder. In the film, the murder is an accident in the novel, it's intentional.
The key problem in terms of the ending, would be the fact that the hero gets away with murder. By 1939, 40, 41, Selznick by now has had it with the Production Code Administration and is willing to really push. And at that time it meant, having Clark Gable say "damn" at the end of Gone with the Wind.
One of the scenes that Hitchcock does just absolutely brilliantly in Rebecca, there's the scene where Max de Winter has to explain what happened that night in the boathouse.
There were discussions during the evolution of the script as to, do we have a flashback? There is no one that you could use playing Rebecca that would do justice to this conjuring of the mind.
In this scene, what Hitchcock's camera does, the camera becomes Rebecca. It's a subjective camera. The camera does what Rebecca did that night.
He's able to keep the audience interested in the story and keep them emotionally involved without ever having to resort to narrative trickery like flashbacks.
One hand in her pocket, the other holding a cigarette. She was smiling. Well, Max, what are you going to do about it? Aren't you going to kill me?
I still think it's a deeply Hitchcockian film in the ways in which it works both formally and narratively to implicate a seemingly normative character, the nameless heroine, and us, the spectators, in an act of criminality of one sort or another, and to make us all root for, not just acquiesce in, but root for somebody getting away with it. And that's the essence of Hitchcock, it seems to me, that plot and that plot device. And, no Selznickian pretension can cover that over.
Selznick learned on Rebecca that he was not going to be able to tell Hitchcock what to do. What Hitchcock learned was that if Selznick had another project to distract him, that he, Hitchcock, as he was making the film, could pretty much do what he wanted. By the time Rebecca is starting in the early fall of 39, Gone with the Wind is nearing completion, and it's madness for Selznick. But he still would take the time to look at the dailies, to write these memos. This is a guy who was having regular injections of B12 and amphetamines. The guy did not have a regular sleeping schedule. He literally had secretaries on call constantly, ready to take dictation, no matter, and I mean 24 hours a day. At they'd cycle through, and he would sleep when he fell down. I mean, he would finally just collapse, and it could be anywhere. And literally, it could be on the floor, it could be on a couch, on a set, And Hitchcock, I went home to Alma and had a drink and had a proper meal, and I mean, had a much more subdued life.
It's maybe an uneasy amalgam of Selznick and Hitchcock, but in the end, I think it serves the novel well. It certainly serves the audience well, and it gives the audience truly a gripping emotional experience that the novel does and the movie does in different ways. So I think Selznick and Hitchcock both won that particular battle.
It's a great tribute in many ways to Hitchcock that he was able to survive this experience with Selznick and turn out a picture that ends up winning the Best Picture Oscar for 1940.
But the Oscar didn't go to Hitchcock for directing that year. It went to John Ford for The Grapes of Wrath.
This was the first Academy Award nomination of 5 for directing for Hitchcock. Hitchcock never won a directing Oscar.
No matter how kind of overbearing Selznick seems to us in retrospect, you have to give the guy credit because he wins back-to-back Best Picture Oscars, 1939, Gone with the Wind, 1940, Rebecca.
Selznick needed Hitchcock more than Hitchcock needed Selznick. It was Hitchcock's good fortune and maybe Selznick's ill fortune to live long enough to see it, that Hitchcock went on from Notorious, beyond the Paradine case, to produce more masterpieces in the 1950s. So during the Hitchcock-Selznick years, though he doesn't know it, Hitchcock is on an upward trend. Selznick is very much on the downward trend. As early as Spellbound and the creation of Spellbound, he knows how the obituary is going to read, the producer of Gone with the Wind.
Hitch was doing a little joke on Selznick in North by Northwest when he named the character Roger O. Thornhill, and I think he said, "What does it stand for?" He says, "Nothing," I think. Zero.
They both took movie, the form, the language, intensely seriously. David believed in his own ability to compose a film from all the pieces. But Hitch was raised in a method that didn't bother with all the pieces. Because Hitch knew there were just these pieces. And that's where they clashed. And that was, I think, always the secret, the source to the fight between them. And they both compromised and tried to compromise, but it was a battle all the way. And of course, in the end, the Hitchcock method triumphs because the Hitchcock method, this extraordinary control, is going to give us Rear Window and Vertigo and Psycho and so on. So he is world famous as a stylist in a way that Selznick never could be. Selznick was taken aback, hurt, miffed, to discover that Hitchcock really, truly knew film much better than he did.
Later on in life, our families actually all vacationed in Switzerland. This is going back to like the 1960s. They maintained a friendship for so many years. Their style of work was completely different. David was 9 million memos a day and very action-packed all day long, you know, screaming and yelling, whereas my grandfather was very quiet, very methodical, went the straight line. That's how he worked, you know, no drama. Besides the fact that they were so different, they did remain friends.
I think they did good work together. I think they stimulated one another. I think history proved that Hitchcock was sometimes made better by his collaborators, and Selznick may have been the greatest collaborator of all.
He spoke to the people then, he speaks to us now. I believe hundreds of years from now, he will be speaking to us just as Shakespeare does. His work will pass the test of time, which is a criterion of art.